Alrighty, so what are we going to do in this presentation? Well, one, we're going to try and define what persuasion is. We'll look at persuasive essays, kind of the fundamentals of them. We'll think about the elements or the structure of persuasive essays, and then we're going to kind of try and synthesize all of these ideas. So number one, what is persuasion? Well, I really like this definition by Merriam-Webster. And they say that it's to move by argument, entreaty, or expostulation to a belief, position, or course of action. Okay, so basically we want to have a certain belief or viewpoint, and we'll use reason and argument to convince them. Okay, so that's kind of what persuasion is. I think we do this in our everyday life. We often try to persuade other people to have certain viewpoints or do things. We can also try to use this to persuade ourselves to do certain things. So persuasion is not something new, but it may be new in terms of the form of essay writing that we are going to do, a new model. Okay, so the fundamentals of persuasive essays. So persuasive essays are just argument essays. It's just a particular kind of argument in the same way Tolman's a certain kind of argument, the way the research essay is a certain kind of argument. Your goal in this particular essay is to get me to understand your viewpoint, but also to agree with you. So keep that in mind as you're writing. How can you get your reader to agree with you? How can you persuade them? All right, so how do we create persuasion? Well, persuasion can be done through emotional appeals. So a lot of experts think that one effective way to persuade an audience is through emotion, which is true. Emotion definitely can sway an audience. So I would highly recommend having that in your essay. But it's also important that in order to make it a sound argument, you have to add some concrete evidence or support. So that is our logical appeals, right? So if we think back to our rhetorical appeals, thinking about pathos and logos, and wanting to have both of those kind of working together simultaneously, that still comes into play in your persuasion essay. So how can we create that? Well, for emotions, we can think diction, we can think tone, we can think anecdotes, we can think examples. If we go back to the first essay when we read Sherry Turkle's article, Flight from Conversation, and she brings in the example of the boy who would rather talk to a robot than his dad, right? That's an emotional anecdote that she brings in, and that kind of creates a certain feeling for her argument. Well, the same can be said about bringing logic in. You need to have some facts, data, again, thinking certain examples or sources that can add that kind of logical foundation for your argument. So yes, while emotion is really great for having persuasion in creating persuasive essays, we want to make sure we're also thinking about the logical appeals. Okay, the next thing that I want to think about, and this is really important when we're creating persuasive essays, is the audience. So persuasive essays can be very successful or very unsuccessful depending on how much the author considers their audience. So you need to consider who is your audience. And like I say here, when we write essays in college, we often write to the teacher since they will be grading the essay. For this persuasion essay, I want you to go beyond that, and I want you to think in the real world. So if you were to write this essay and publish it somewhere, who would be your audience? Who are you writing to? That's kind of who you need to gear your essay towards. So how can you do that? Well, again, thinking about diction, thinking about tone, thinking about sources, thinking about examples, thinking about the balance of emotional or logical appeals, and also thinking about counter arguments. So maybe some counter arguments will appeal more to certain audiences versus others. So you want to be aware of your audience. Not everything's going to persuade everybody. So be aware of who you're writing to and the way in which you can form your essay to speak to that audience. Now, of course, I will be reading your essay because I have to grade it, right? So you do have to keep that in mind, but I really want you to focus and think about who would you want this to be read? Who would you want to read this? What audience member would you want to read this? That sentence is not coming out the way I want it to, but I think you understand what I'm saying. Think about the real life audience here. There we go. I got it. Okay, so why do we write persuasive essays? Well, again, we're trying to convince our reader of a certain point of view, not just present an argument, but we want them to walk away being convinced of our argument. So here are some elements of a persuasive essays. So you, of course, need your introduction. Just like any other introduction, you need to have a clear overview of ideas and present your thesis statement. Evidence is very important. Again, thinking about the pathos and the logos, having that balance in there. This is also where we'd like to see some sort of solution. So that's part of this prompt, is to suggest some sort of solution to the problem, and your evidence can be part of that. Opposing argument, so that counter argument. Being aware not only of other point of views can kind of help your reader see that you understand the topic as a whole, but it can also kind of diminish any maybe thoughts in your reader's mind as to why your argument isn't sound. So bringing in that counter argument is very important. And finally, the conclusion. And again, like the introduction, it should have the same things that many argument essays have: restating your thesis, restating your main ideas, and giving one final statement. What do you want to leave your reader thinking about? All right, so to wrap up, remember that your persuasive essay is not just to present an argument, but it's to convince someone of your viewpoint. You want to keep in mind the balance of the emotional and the logical appeals. Be aware of your audience. And finally, make sure your point of view is clear, consistent, and present throughout the entire essay. All right, everyone. I hope that was helpful. Have a good day. Bye.